Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's get started. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. For those of you that are interested in how evolutionary robotics fits into the larger landscape of robotics and AI, together with a whole bunch of other co-authors, we published a paper in Nature magazine yesterday with the title Machine Behavior. Together with some of my colleagues at MIT and Northeastern, we're calling for this new field of machine behavior, which, like ethology, the study of animal behavior, is becoming increasingly difficult for us to understand how AI is working and how a robot is working and being able to predict how complex and intelligent machines will behave in certain circumstances. It's a very important topic at the moment, otherwise known as safe AI. If you're interested in the larger landscape, might be worth going to have a look. If you go to my Twitter feed, you can find a link to the paper. And there are also a series of video interviews with a whole bunch of the co-authors. Obviously, you can hear me talk even more about evolutionary robotics if you're not tired of my voice yet. A lot of other leaders in the field of AI and robotics talking about the different aspects of how do we actually try and understand and predict machine behavior. I know you all have plenty of free time at this time of year, so knock yourselves out. Okay, back to evolutionary robotics. We'll dive back in to our discussion of the evolution of communication in a moment. Any questions about final projects that I can answer for you? No? All good? Okay, so just as a reminder, we have this two-lecture series on collective robotics. You can imagine a lot of applications in the real world where creating one large complex machine is maybe not the right approach. Instead, we'd like to create a large number of simpler machines that somehow coordinate their actions to cooperatively perform something that would be difficult or impossible for a single machine to perform. Last time, we saw some virtual lions chasing a virtual gazelle in a virtual Serengeti plain. And the lions were demonstrating evolved coordination. And as we saw in that lecture, it's not always obvious how to actually evolve behaviors for a group. The easiest thing, like we saw with the Boyd's approach, is to give exactly the same behavior to all members of the group, but that's not really ideal because how does that limit the team?
They can't specialize.
They can't specialize, right? So we saw in the case of the pride of lions that one or a few of them were specializing, and the others knew who were the specialists and altered their behavior accordingly, right? Usually in nature, this would be done by some form of signaling or visual communication. I can see what the other members of my team are doing, but as we start to scale up the complexity of the task, that requires more and more individuals in the team, we can't necessarily assume that they can all see each other and that they're in constant contact. So it may make sense for one or a few of them to start signaling or broadcasting the others hear and respond accordingly. That leads to the evolution of communication, and we started to talk about that last time by looking at this relatively simple setup where we have a discrete world in this case. We have a grid of 200 by 200 squares, and any one square can be occupied by a female robot or a male robot, and as we saw last time, they have different sensor motor abilities. Females are equipped with a particular neural network where they can sense the positions and orientations of a male in their signal sensing radius. Given the male that they sense, they can emit a binary string, which is a quote-unquote song. If there are any males in a female's territory, the male receives that binary string at their input layer. So they hear the song, and depending on the binary values of that song, it propagates through the neural controller of the male down to the output layer of the male. The output layer is a vector of integers. We take the maximum integer, and that indicates which of four possible actions the male can perform. So there's four output neurons: stay still, move forward, turn left, or turn right. Right? As we ended with last time, if a female successfully signals to a male and the male successfully interprets that song correctly, the male will move to and into the same square as the female. They mate. The male and female parent produce a male and female child, and that male and female child overwrite one other male and one other female somewhere else in the world. And the two parents are then separated and placed at two random positions as well. Right? So this is a slightly different evolutionary algorithm from what we've seen before. There are no generations. There is simply one time step after the other in this world. At every time step, the females sing and the males move, and possibly pairs mate, produce offspring, overwrite others. Next time step, same thing, and on and on and on. So far, so good with the setup? Okay. Let's now have a look at what happens. Let's assume that the females are going to sing 3-digit long songs and the males are going to hear 3-digit long songs. How many output neurons are there in the female network? And how many input neurons are there in the male network?
3 in the female network and 3 in the male network.
Exactly. So the output layer of the female in this set of experiments has 3 output neurons, which corresponds to her song, and the male has 3 input neurons. The male can hear 1 of 8 possible songs. Okay, so we're going to walk through an evolutionary run here, and at time step 100, so at time step 100, all the females have sang 100 times, each of the 800 males has moved 100 times, and there has been a series of mating events, reproduction, and dying off of other individuals. So the total population stays constant. We have 800 males and 800 females, and at time step 100, we can ask the question of any male that moves into a female territory and that female sings the song 000, on average, what do males do when they hear that song? So the elements in this matrix correspond to the percentage of behaviors, percentage of males that either moved forward when they heard that song, turned right when they heard that song, turned left when they heard that song, or stood still. And then we can ask the same question for the other 7 songs. Not surprisingly, this early on in the evolutionary run, the males are basically moving randomly. They're choosing one of these actions at random, and the females are singing at random. It's kind of what you'd expect, right? What do you think happens as we continue this evolutionary run?
Probably a lot less standing still.
A lot less standing still. If you're a male, you can be guaranteed that if you stand still, you are not going to mate at the next time step. Best thing to do is at least to move. Is there any communication yet? Do the female songs have any meaning yet?
I think the males are mostly interpreting any signal to mean move forward. Right now.
Any signal to mean forward, right? Exactly. So not only are they not standing still, but they're tending to move forward more often than not already. So in a way, the songs may be starting to mean something. However, remember that the males can also be outside of any female song radius, in which case they're hearing no song, which corresponds to 000. So if a male enters a female territory and she sings the song 000, from the point of view of the male, it's complete silence.
Do the females know the position of the male in their radius?
They do.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. So it's a little hard to see here. The input layer of the female is, we encode that as the position and orientation of the closest male. So yes, she can. She can't sense all the males in her territory, just the one that's closest. Do the other 7 songs mean move forward? Why not?
Because the male is operating with the same probabilities no matter what it hears, even if it hears
hear silence.
Absolutely. So the probabilities more or less are the same for 0, 0, 0 as the other 7 songs. So at this point, the males are not really listening to anything. A short time later, this is the situation. Is there any evolution of communication yet?
What happened to 0, 0, 0?
I think it's a typo.
Okay.
This should be 0, 0, 0. Yeah.
Okay. Same deal, except they're more consistently moving forward.
They're more consistently moving forward. Not unlike males from other species, they're completely ignoring whatever the females are trying to say, if they're trying to say anything at this point. Why move forward? Why not turn left or turn right?
Does the grid, does the left side of the grid wrap around?
Yes, so same as last time, we have a toroidal grid. They're moving on a huge donut. There is no edge, but they wrap around to the other side.
Because turning is kind of like standing still where you don't get any further.
Absolutely. If you think about these 4 actions, you're guaranteed at the next time step to not mate if you stay still, turn left, or turn right. You have a non-zero probability of mating if you move forward. So the males are already starting to evolve to do what you would expect, which is move forward.
Why are we even giving them the ability to stand still, the males?
I guess we could leave that out. Probably, I would imagine you get more or less the same result with just the 3 actions rather than the 4. Any evolution of communication yet? Not yet, right? Okay. What do you think happens next?
They'll eventually hit a state where none of the females line up with any of the males, and so they'll just be stuck.
The males will just be stuck, you mean, if they're moving straight. So if a male is moving straight, it's either tracing out a row in this giant donut or a column in this giant donut forever, which is, at the moment, is what all of the males are doing. What do you think happens next? Could be that we've reached a steady state, nothing happens. But since we're here talking about this experiment, you can probably guess that's not what happens. What has to happen next for this situation to change?
They have to change their song.
Possibly. Do the females have to change their song? Who has to change here?
The males.
The males have to change, right? If the best you can do is trace out the same row over and over again, or the same column over and over again, sometimes, just by chance, a mating event will occur, and a male will produce a male child, and that child will suffer a mutation to its neural network, and that male child likely, in all likelihood, will do what its father did, which is more or less move straight most of the time. But the mutation may, under a few circumstances, cause that male child to turn left or turn right when it hears one or a few of these songs. By chance, it might just happen to do it at just the right moment. When the female emits a certain song, the male turns left. The male turns left, which means from the female's point of view, the male is now at a different position and orientation. The female changes her song, and the male goes back to doing what the male usually does, which is move forward. If that chance event caused that male to mate with the female, what's going to happen in the grandson and the granddaughter? The 2 children from that union.
They'll replace a less effective parent.
They'll replace 2 other parents. You say less effective. We're assuming that the 2 grandchildren are already more effective. Are they? We have one male which is now tends to turn left when he hears one or maybe a couple of songs, and a female that had to have done what to cause this mating event to occur?
Change the song when the male was in a certain position.
Change her song when the male was at a certain position. It may just happen by chance, right? And it's probably a low probability event, but we have 800 females and 800 males in this system. So there's a low probability event here, which is low probability because it has to do with communication. Evolving communication is a particularly difficult trait to evolve, more difficult than evolving bipedal locomotion or manipulating objects. What is so particularly challenging about the evolution of communication compared to the evolution of the other cognitive abilities we've looked at?
They kind of have to line up, like the signal that the female was doing has to stay around, and the response has to also stay around.
Absolutely right. So a mutation event has to get two things right, both. That the female has to signal at the appropriate time, and the male has to respond appropriately when it hears that song, right? As you can probably imagine, eventually, by time step 15,000, so 15,000 time steps later, we now have this situation. What's happening now?
There's a specific turn left and right signal.
There's now a turn left and a turn right signal. So now 101 means something. For some of the males, not all of them, it means turn left, and the song 110 means something different for not all the males, but for a vast majority of them means turn right. Turn right and then turn left. Okay. Okay, so the males have evolved to turn in the right direction when they're on the same row or column as a female. So the female has evolved to emit these two meaningful songs when there is a male in the same row or the same column as her.
The song itself was evolved, right? I mean,
Exactly. Why does 101 mean left? Why isn't it 011?
Again, it could be a different one that gets picked as the signal.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But the confusing thing here is the female is not evolving, it's just based on the random weights it had, which can mean that it's just not bothering about the location, two different locations singing the same song.
Okay, so the claim is that the females are not evolving, that the males are evolving to respond appropriately to songs. Are the females evolving? And if they are, what trait are they evolving?
I mean, the females have input neurons of the position of the nearest male, so if when the male is like to the left of the female would sing the song "Turn Right."
The females were more effective songs.
Exactly. Imagine a female at this point during the evolutionary process that emits the song 101 all the time. How likely is that female to attract a male who knows the language, who knows what to do when he hears 101?
Or those females end up like generating a kind of event horizon of males who are just stuck turning right forever.
Absolutely they will, right? So that female would fail to attract any males who know to turn left when they hear 101. What's going to happen to that female eventually?
Get replaced with a better one and immediately attract every single male in her radius.
Possibly. So she's not attracting any males. She's not mating. And as we mentioned here, when a mating event occurs, the two new children are going to replace a random male and female somewhere else in the environment. So eventually that female will be replaced with another female, a female offspring.
They don't go to the exact same spot. You X out the ones that were there and go to different spots.
Sorry, okay. So here's, at this point, this is a cartoon of a mating event. So the male has found this female.
Okay.
This male and female the male produces a male child and the female produces a female child. There's no actual crossover, so this is not really a mating event. They produce a male child and a female child. Those two children go out in the environment. The male child replaces a male somewhere in the environment. The female child replaces a female somewhere in the environment. But that leaves the male and female parents still back in this square. They are taken out of that square and they're placed at two random positions in the grid, but two empty squares. So the children overwrite two existing males and females, and the parents are separated and just placed at different positions so that they don't immediately produce another pair of offspring at the next time step. So far, so good?
So when the offspring replace a male and female,
Yes.
are they replacing at random, or are they replacing a poorly performing pair?
At random.
Could have like, it's at random.
At random, absolutely.
There's a 1 in 799 chance that they're gonna.
And also, you wouldn't be able to tell which ones are poorly performing because they don't have like a fitness.
There's no fitness function, there's no fitness value here, right? It's kind of a very different from all the evolutionary algorithms we've seen so far.
If in that same step, a couple had made it, do they get to generate the children before they're X?
That's a good question.
So
I'm not
they would be
sure.
rewarded for
There could be more than one mating event during one time step. That's correct. I don't know whether they're protected from deletion if they're in the process of producing two offspring. It's a good question. I don't think that's described in the paper. I imagine it's a pretty low probability event. Maybe not towards the end when
Well,
the...
even if you generated the children before you X'd out them, I mean, if the children got generated and then you
Yep.
did the pruning.
I'm not sure. It's a good question.
Wouldn't you eventually reach some kind of like mediocrity threshold where the mating events happen just often enough to kill off any better performing offspring before they can really take over the...
Good question. Are we going to reach a local optimum or some sort of mediocre level of behavior? What is the optimal here? What is the best possible thing that males and females can do? It's not, at least to me, it wasn't immediately clear when I first read this paper. At 15,000 time steps, this is the situation. As I mentioned, at this point, the females have evolved. They are not signaling at random. They are signaling when a male reaches their row or their column, right? The males are mostly moving forward, right? So if you think about males moving forward, they're entering the four corners of the female square sensing radius. And as they move through that sensing radius, as they're moving forward, if they hit the same row or column, the females know, or they have evolved to emit one of the other two signals to turn, which causes the male to turn while the male is on the same row or column as the female. And when the male is now facing towards the female, what do you think the female sings at that point?
Besides the turn left, turn right.
Anything, any of the other six signals, and males will do what they tend to do, which is move forward and they will find the female.
I wonder if you ran this again with only 3 songs, if it would still work.
We'll see, we're going to see another experiment kind of like that in a few minutes. Is this it? Is there anything better that can happen here? Let's have a look. So, as I mentioned, females evolved to use this signal, but as time goes on beyond the 15,000 time steps, they use it for more situations. So in this case, where the female has a 5x5 sensing radius, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 possible locations. And for each of those 8 locations, the male can be at one of 4 orientations. So there's a total of 32 situations from the point of view of the female. And in all 32 of those situations, she may not do the right thing. She may give the wrong signal. And if she gives the wrong signal, what can happen? Could turn in the wrong direction and maybe then move outside of her sensing radius, and she's lost a mating opportunity. The male might continue, but then she's able to recapture the male. It's not quite clear. So as evolution continues here, the females improve their ability to know, quote unquote know, when and where to sing the right song. Okay. Let's pause this experiment for a moment. We're going to look at a little bit of testing that they did. They paused this simulation. We're going to come back to it. Sorry, we're not going to come back to it. That's the end of this run. We're going to look at a second experiment in a moment. So at this point, we have females that are signaling successfully to males and males that are correctly interpreting those songs. Okay. They went back then to the beginning, wiped everything, and started with initial random conditions. They ran a control test, which is this curve here. In this case, they deafened the males. Everything is the same except males cannot hear the females. They ran this simulation for 60,000 time steps. And on the vertical axis, they recorded the average number of moves required by a male until it successfully mated. So as you can imagine, higher points are worse and lower points are better. It corresponds to more frequent mating. Out here is what you would expect to see, right? The deafened males mate with females on average 100 time steps. And when we did what we just described before, where the males can hear the female songs, the males evolved to mate every 50 time steps. So obviously evolution is useful here for both the males and the females. What's kind of interesting is what's happening here. So at the initial time steps of the simulation, the deafened males mate more often than the males that can hear. Why?
The males that can hear were moving randomly. They had more things to worry about.
Okay. Can we be a little bit more specific than that?
So this is a random chance, the males that can hear might just be going around in circles and stuff?
They might be going around in circles, right? So the males that can hear, they're hearing the female songs. And early on here, when not a lot of evolution has gone on, who knows what the males are going to do when the song changes, right? It's probably going to change their behavior. What should the males be doing before any language evolves? Going straight, right? So not surprisingly, it's easier for the deaf males to go straight. They just evolve a neural network that always causes them to go straight. The undeafened males don't always go straight. So this is meant to illustrate the fact that there is a cost to communication. In any species, biological or artificial, you have the evolution of the signaler and the evolution of the signaled, the one that sings and the one that hears, right? And it takes a while for these two parties to get on the same page so that the listener interprets and acts correctly given the signals produced by the signaler, right? Getting both of these things to work well is significantly costly. It takes a while. A cost in the sense that, at least in the short term, the best thing is just not to listen at all and just blindly carry out a behavior that does okay. Okay, let's have a look at this in action. I apologize. Let me see if I can zoom in. Maybe that's better. If I can remember how to do that. Okay, so we have a female here. She's emitting the song 110. We have a male that is outside her sensing radius, so she does not sense any males in her territory at the moment. The male is northwest, moving to the east. The male enters her territory, and the female changes her song to 011. And that does not alter the male's behavior. The male continues moving forward until the male enters the same column as the female, and the female now changes her song to 101, which causes the male to turn not to the right, but to the left. What should the female do in this case? This is not looking very good for an imminent mating event.
Be the same signal so it turns left again.
Exactly. So she continues correctly to send the same song, which causes the male to turn left again, and now she changes her song to 011, which the male interprets as move forward. When I was growing up in Toronto, I had a great uncle. He was never very comfortable with driving, a lot of cars on the road in Toronto. Never wanted to make a left at a stoplight. He always made rights, which if you're in a very large city with a very large grid, you can still get wherever you want to go as long as you always make rights. So every time I see this experiment, it reminds me of my great uncle, right? Takes a while, but these two managed to mate. Okay. Imagine the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of these parents. Can they do better? What needs to happen to reduce the time between mating events in this particular species?
The male would have had to turn right to reduce some of the time.
Which is possible, right? Eventually some mutation probably occurs in that lineage in which the male turns right when he hears that song rather than left. And as long as the female is able to interpret that movement as the right movement and issue the song that causes the male to move forward, we're okay, right? Okay. Okay, let's look at another experiment now where we're going to reduce the female song to just 4 songs rather than 8. We're going to have 2 output neurons in the female neural network and 2 input neurons in the male neural network. It gives us only 4 songs, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. We can then plot in this initially difficult to read plot exactly what every male is doing when a female issues any of the 4 songs. So the way to read this is, for example, let's visit the top left here. This should actually say 0, 0, 0, 0. You'll notice to the right of every colon here, there are 4 digits. Those 4 digits correspond to the 4 female songs. The first digit is what does the male do when it hears song 1. The second digit, what does the male do when it hears song 2? Third digit, what does the male do when it hears song 3? Fourth digit, what does the male do when it hears song 4? The digit itself is either 0, 1, 2, or 3, as you can see if you look at this entire table. And that digit corresponds to the 3 actions that the males can perform. 0 represents that when the male hears the first song, that male moves forward. A 1, for example, in the first digit down here means that this male goes forward when it hears the first song, and so on. The number to the left of the colon is the total number of males that have that behavior. So if we go back up to the top left here, this should be 4 colon followed by 4 zeros. There are 4 males that do what?
Nothing. They just stay still.
They stay still, right? Regardless of which of the 4 songs the female emits, 0, the male's output 0. They stay still. In this cell of the matrix, there are 6 males that do what? At this point, at time 0 in the simulation.
Go forward for only 1 song.
They go forward for only 1 song, which is the 4th song, 1-1. So far, so good? Okay, just to test our intuition, let's go to the bottom right. There are 6 males that do what? Always turn right. You don't want to be in that group, right? Okay. Okay. So in this situation here, it's a little difficult to get right. Let me see if I can zoom in for a moment. Okay. Oh, I apologize. Okay. This is, I think, the best we can do here. As you would imagine, at T0 here, we've got a wide distribution of males that are doing everything you can possibly imagine. Let's do what we did before, which is move forward a little bit. So now at time step 8,000, most groups of males have gone extinct. We can see they're clumping up into different lineages. We have a large group here, 547 males that respond to 1311, right? So they're going forward most of the time, but they turn right when they hear the second song. They turn left when they hear the second song, and they're responding to females that, the females that they mate with only ever produce the first two songs. Those females never emit songs 3 and 4. So we're really only seeing the males here. We're not seeing what the females are doing. If we continue to run this simulation forward, do you think that all 800 males are eventually going to end up in this cell? Are they all going to do the same thing?
But this only works if the male is coming towards the female from the left-hand side. You would need to substitute that 3 for a 2 for the other half of the situation.
Possibly, or like my great uncle, they'll just make 3 rights to make 1 left.
So is it possible that this is a local optima because turn right is only 1 mutation away from going forward, while turn left is 2 mutations away? And
That's a good observation, right? This is probably a local optima for several reasons. Let's see what happens. As we move on to 10,000 time steps, there's another grouping here that's starting to emerge, 127 males that respond to 1113. So they they go forward when they hear songs 1 and 2. And remember, there's a group of females that only emit songs 1 and 2. Those males are going to miss that group of females most of the time. They're going to sail right past. There is a second group of males that are responding to songs 3 and 4, and it turns out that there is a separate group of females that only emit signals or songs 3 and 4. What's happening?
Certain males are specializing behavior to the behavior of specialized females.
Absolutely, and vice versa. Those females are improving when and where they emit songs 3 and 4 to make sure they capture more of these males more often. And the same thing is happening in the other group of males and females.
So we do speciation, will we end up with 2 subgroups that are incompatible?
We already have 2 groups that are incompatible, right? So there's not just 2 species here. What else is there 2 of? There are 2 languages here, right? There's 2 groups that speak that language, produce that language, the 2 female groups, and there are 2 males that understand one of those 2 languages, but not the other. Right? So not just the evolution of communication, the evolution of 2 separate languages.
Seems like the random replacement would lead to the majority language dominating.
That's a good question, right? So what's going to happen at this point, right? With random replacement, one of these groups is much more populous than the other. Is it going to drive the other group to extinction, and we'll be left with a monoculture, just one language spoken by all? What else is possible here?
So both of these only have one like turning right, so I feel like they're both like equally as fit. But if some other language evolved that had a turn right and a turn left,
Possibly.
if by chance both of them mutate, then we might get a bilingual.
Exactly. If you are a male and you exist in this universe at this time, the best possible thing you can do is be bilingual, right? Know what to do when you hear songs 1 and 2 emitted by the first group of females, and those females never emit songs 3 and 4, so you're okay. However, if you move into the territory of a female that belongs to the other group and she starts singing songs 3 and 4, if you know what to do when you hear those 2 signals, you're bilingual and you're likely to mate with either females from both groups. Have those bilingual males started to evolve yet, given this picture? Where would they be in this picture?
It's the group of 20 on the right column.
There are 20 males here that go straight when they hear song 1, turn right when they hear song 2, go straight when they hear song 3, and turn right when they hear song 4. What this picture doesn't tell you is whether they do those actions under the right conditions. They're doing the right things. It's whether the females can attract these bilingual males.
Because you'd also need bilingual females that don't, when they want a male to go straight, they can't give the signal to turn right in the other language.
Remember that both groups of females only speak or only emit two of the four signals. They never emit. These females down here never emit song 3 and 4, and the females associated with this group never emit song 1 and 2. So actually, these 20 bilingual males are in a very good situation. If they find females from group 1 or females from group 2, if all goes well and they happen to be the closest male to either of those females, they're going to mate with those females. Okay, so keep an eye on this box, and this box of bilingual males. This is after 12,000 time steps, 14,000 time steps, 16,000 time steps, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. This says 1,600 here. I think this should be 800. They might have done it with 1,600 males and 1,600 females. How many of you only speak English? Think on that. Okay. All right, I'll leave that there. Okay. That concludes our discussion of the evolution of communication and our discussion of collective robotics. Obviously, there's a lot more that we could cover, but we're going to move on now to the final theme of the course, and we've already seen this a few times before, the evolution of bodies and brains. As I mentioned right at the beginning of the course, there are a lot of learning algorithms out there in AI, but as the name learning implies, it usually means that the training algorithm or the AI algorithm is optimizing or tuning the parameters describing a neural network. They're tuning up the brain for a pattern recognizer or a robot or a classifier or a recommendation system or an autonomous car. They are not altering the body in which that neural network operates. This is the reason why in evolutionary robotics we use evolutionary algorithms rather than learning algorithms. Ultimately, we want to broaden the reach of the evolutionary algorithm and allow it to tinker with all aspects of the artificial agent, body plan, and the neural controller. So we're going to look now in lecture 25 at the first attempt to do this by Carl Sims. Carl is a computer graphics researcher and was interested about creating animations of 3D creatures. So we're back to simulation. This was work that was reported back in 1994, around the same time that the field of evolutionary robotics was even getting going. I told you at the beginning of the course that physics engines weren't invented until the year 2000. That was a bit of I misspoke there a little bit. There was one exception. Carl sat down and made his own physics engine back in 1994 and used it to evolve these virtual creatures. So we'll watch the 4-minute video of some of Carl's creatures, and then we'll dive into the details of how he actually did this.
This demonstration shows virtual creatures that were evolved to perform specific tasks in simulated physical environments. Swimming speed was used to determine survival. Most of the creatures are results from independent evolutions. Some developed strategies similar to those in real life. Once they're evolved, multiple copies of these creatures can be made and simulated together in the same environment. The next group of creatures were evolved for their ability to move on a simulated land environment with gravity and friction. Some simple solutions with just 2 parts were found. Some seemed like they could use some assistance, while others were fairly efficient, such as this rowing-like behavior. Here is an odd cousin of the previous. A mutation caused him to tumble. Some creatures evolved to incorporate contact sensors in their control systems. Here is another inchworm-like creature that tends to go in circles. This was actually a creature first evolved for its ability to swim in water, then later put on land and evolved further. A successful sidewinding ability resulted. Here is one with a hopping style. The protrusions on its arms seemed to help prevent it from tipping over. This was the fastest, with a successful galloping-like stride. This group was evolved for their jumping ability. This group was evolved for their ability to adaptively follow a red light source. The resulting creatures are now being interacted with. A user is moving the light source around as the creature behaves. This one seems to flail randomly, but somehow still manages to approach the light. Perhaps it is mean to move the goal away just as it arrives. Here is one that has propeller-like fins which are tilted depending on the direction of the light. It can adaptively swim up or down very well. This final group of creatures was evolved for their ability to compete for control of a green cube.
Okay, we're going to watch a series of now competing robots. As you watch this, think about the fitness function for either member of the competition here.
The creature closest to the cube at the end of a simulation is the winner. Here, a strategy first arose for simply tumbling towards the cube. Then one learned to block out his opponent. But then later one learned to overcome the obstacle by climbing over it. Some pinned down their opponents. Some covered the cube with protective arms. Others simply unfolded onto the cube. The success of a strategy is often highly dependent on the opponent. Here is a hockey-playing creature, which takes the cube away and wins by a large margin. Here are two similar hockey strategies battling it out, with appropriate gestures. This crab-like creature walks well, but often continues past the cube and instead seems to prefer beating up on his opponent. Against the arm, the crab seems to simply walk away. A successful strategy is this two-arm technique that swipes quickly in from the side and moves the cube over to a second arm. These are the final rounds of competition amongst the overall best. Finally, the seeker arm goes against the side swiper, but the cube is just out of reach.
Could watch those all day, right?
For some reason, it's way cuter than Pyrosim.
Way cuter than Pyrosim.
Yeah.
You'll notice if you go back and watch that, they also do real-time ray tracing. When they had the red light, you could see it reflected on the surface of the robots. This was 1994. Pretty amazing. Pretty amazing at the time. Amazing today, 25, 35 years later, however long it is. Pretty impressive. Way ahead of its time. Okay. So at the beginning of this course, we talked about the two experiments from Europe. You might remember the inverted periscope from Sussex, and then the small hockey puck type Kepler robot that was running around on the tabletop. This is sort of the third experiment that kicked off the field of evolutionary robotics for obvious reasons. Aside from Carl Sims's incredible coding talents, he had another thing that was helping him in the background, which was the Connection Machine 5. So back in the late 80s and early 90s, there were attempts to create parallel supercomputers. One of the most famous and most successful was Connection Machine 5. Part of its success was it had these very sexy blinking red lights on its panels, which allowed it to show up in some Hollywood movies like Jurassic Park and so on. Connection Machine 5 had 1,024 cores inside. Each of these cores was connected in a hypercube arrangement. Each core was connected to 10 of its neighbors. which means you have a 10-dimensional hypercube. What is 2 to the 10?
1024.
Which gives us that, right? So we've got not only a lot of cores, but heavily connected cores that can communicate with one another. For those that are interested in the history of computing, the CM5 could reach a peak of 131 gigaflops per second, floating point operations per second. Just to give you a little bit of comparison, the Mac Pro, the highest end desktop Mac you can get today, is slightly slower. So not a bad machine. It definitely was a very large machine, but significant computing power. All the runs that you just saw were carried out for 300, using population size of 300 for 100 generations, about 3 hours to get each of these animations. Not bad, right? Okay. Okay, so let's have a look at how this evolutionary algorithm actually works. As always, we have a population of genotypes, which are on the left here. The genotype is the blueprint for the phenotype, and in this case, the phenotype is a description of the robot's body and its neural controller, which in this slide we can't see yet. We see now yet another data structure for encoding genotypes. Genetic algorithms tend to encode vectors and matrices. We talked about genetic programming on Tuesday, where genotypes tend to be encoded as trees. In this case, our genomes are graphs, so we have collections of nodes and edges. But we're encoding a specific kind of graph, a nested directed multigraph. So we'll break this term down. It's directed in the sense that edges that connect one node to another, or the node to itself, has a directed edge. That makes sense. It's a multigraph, meaning that there can be not just a single edge connecting pairs of nodes, but there can be multiple edges, more than one, from one node to the next. You may or may not have seen these kinds of networks before. And then finally, it's a nested graph, which you can't see in this picture, but in a nested graph, each node in the graph contains its own graph. So inside each node is a smaller network of nodes and edges. What do you think those nodes and edges represent inside each individual node in the genotype?
A joint.
Not quite. As you can probably figure out by looking at this picture and the terms here, the genotype here, the graph here is going to represent how to construct the body. What do you think the networks inside, the graphs inside each node in each of these graphs represents?
Is it a branch or certain category of body part? So, like the first one has just one, so it's the same structure for the entire.
Not quite. There are some values that are stored in this node that specify the segment size and orientation and shape. What else do you think the genotype needs to encode? Clearly the genotype is encoding the body. What are we missing? Inside the synapses and the neurons as well. So inside each of these nodes, as we'll see in a moment, there's also encoding of the brain or the neural structure that is placed inside of that segment or that part of the robot. That's the nested part. We'll come back to that in a few slides. Okay. Obviously, the phenotypes, as you can see here, they're going to be the virtual creatures themselves, where the body is a series of segments or objects connected by joints with sensors and motors, not that different from what we do in PyroSim. The way that we convert a genotype into a phenotype, known as the genotype to phenotype mapping, is going to be recursive. What do we mean by that? Well, if we look at, for example, this example up here, we have a single node, and as it says here, segment. So inside this node are a series of numbers that describe a rectangular segment. Where should this segment be placed? What is the length, width, and height of this segment? If we then travel along one of these edges, we come back to segment. The edges also have a series of numbers associated with them, and each of those numbers is a delta. It says how to change the position and orientation and shape of the segment that you just left. So when you come back to this segment, there are descriptions about how to create a segment, again. But if we add in those deltas, we're creating a segment with a slightly different position and orientation and shape.
How many iterations of it do you do? Like, how does it know that?
How does it know when to stop,
Yeah.
right?
And then also for the one that kind of looks like an ant or something, like why, is it going by like time step, like it starts with this and then it iterates into another body section and 2 legs, but then wouldn't the most recent body section be behind on making legs, so by the time it's over, every time you go down a body section, the ones that came first would have longer legs?
That's a good question. Okay, so let's look at this one now. So we have, let's start here. We have body segment, which describes this object right here. So we place that object, or we send it, in our case, we would send it to Pyrosim. And then we're going to follow, from this node outward, we're going to follow all 3 edges. In reality, we're following them in parallel, which is a little bit hard to think about. So let's just do it in sequence. Right? Let's follow these 2 edges first, which describe deltas and take us to this leg segment. The first time we travel along this edge, we place this leg segment here. When we travel along this edge, we place this leg segment here. So we now have 3 objects, the back part of the body and 2 back upper legs that have been made so far. Yep.
And another body, right?
And if we then follow this 3rd edge, we have a 3rd set of deltas, which are labeling this edge. We compute those deltas and come back to body segment and create a new body segment, but it's placed at a different position and a different orientation.
But then if you ran it again, the same thing, the legs that already exist would grow out one.
So let's go back to this leg segment here. We've followed this edge, and we've just created this leg segment, and we followed this edge, and we're now sitting inside of this node. So we need to follow all the outgoing edges of this node as well, which travel around and come back, and those deltas produce this leg segment down here.
So is there a maximum length that it cuts off?
There's a maximum length that it cuts.
Until everything is satisfying.
Absolutely. So inside of each node, there's a single integer, the recursive limit. Every time we visit a node, we decrease that value. When it reaches 0, we no longer follow the outgoing edges from the node. Okay, so you can sort of get the idea for how this works, right? So you can see that head in the humanoid example has no outgoing edges. We're going to go there and just do things once, which is place 1 head. We have body here. We place 1 body, and there's a recursive limit. The recursive limit here is 0. We only build 1 body. We're following 4 outgoing edges, and each of those 4 outgoing edges has different deltas associated with it, which give us this object, this object, this object, and this object, all specified by stuff that's in limb segment. Yeah? Okay. So in this example here, imagine we have a population of these 3 graphs, and each one produces a different phenotype. If we mutate these graphs, what happens? What can happen?
You can get completely different phenotypes, or just maybe like more segments if you increase like the recursive limit and things like that.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, inside of each of these nodes, there are a number of node labels. And those labels, or those numbers associated with the nodes, specify dimensions, body part dimensions. They also specify joint parameters. This is a little bit confusing. You would imagine that each node specifies an object, and each edge specifies a joint. Doesn't work that way. Each node has information about the body part that is placed, as well as the joint that connects that object back to the object that was just created, right? The parent object, if you like. The first node that's ever visited when you're creating the phenotype, there is no parent node. It's the first node you visited. So we just place an object, no joint. Every other object that's visited as you're constructing the phenotype, by definition, that node has a node that you just left. It may be the same node. But that node that you arrive at has information about how to connect that object back to the object you just created. Okay, so we have information about body parts, joint types. As I mentioned, because this is a recursive encoding, we also have this recursive limit. And edges also have labels associated with them. As I mentioned, they have these deltas. If we just created an object that has a certain length, width, and height, when we leave it, we compute, we travel along an edge and take change in position, orientation, and scale, and apply that to the new object we're going to create when we get to the new node. We also have things like reflection. So reflection is a binary value. It can say place the new edge like this, but if you travel along this edge the next time, reflect it, create it on the other side. So there's some terms in there that produce bilateral symmetry, rotational symmetry, reflection about the left and right axis, not unlike we saw when we looked at hyperneat. Hyperneat was the algorithm that was painting regular patterns on a two-dimensional surface or inside of a three-dimensional volume. We can wire up random graphs, and when we read them off and construct a phenotype, we get phenotypes that have repeating structure, symmetry, and so on. Finally, there is an additional edge label in here called the terminal only flag. The terminal only flag is set to 0. As we visit a node, if we get to a node and that we've reached the recursive limit of that node, and we travel along that edge, we flip that terminal only node to true, and we travel along an edge we've never traveled on, an outgoing edge from a node. That edge is only ever followed when that node is exhausted. We've used up its recursive limit. What is this terminal only? Why is this terminal only flag in there?
It lets you make hands on the ends of arms.
Exactly, right? So an arm may be made up of repeated segments that are created recursively, and when you've reached the limit of that recursion, you're finished, and then there's a special node that can be traveled to if it has the terminal only flag set to true, and that new node that you're visiting when you finish creating an arm maybe specifies a hand and fingers and so on. Okay. Here are 12 actual phenotypes that were evolved. I want you to turn to your neighbor, pick one or a couple of these 12, and think about the encoding. What was the genotype that produced this phenotype? You don't have to try and guess all the parameters. I suggest you focus on the nodes themselves. How many actual nodes were required to specify these things? And what was the recursive limit inside those nodes? Some are a little bit easier than others to figure out. Turn to your neighbor, see what you can figure out, and then we'll see what you came up with.
Yeah, so like, just take 6 recursive ads from there, and I see that 2 So like,
Maybe the scales. Look at but I'm not sure if that's like
every time
how each box is its own type object. Number 8, I'm kind of interested in starts at the end or starts at the end.
So, draw draw like this. So
It's like the way it moves, like it seems like it's got like a hand. It has those two fingers.
and those fingers.
It kind of moves like
So this two means that the body can extend to two things. So the body can the body causes this it decrements so this set could like give us like 3 molecules okay, so here you get and then like each one, if we wanted, we could put yes, each one.
symmetry of those two.
So this actually saying that this
Okay, as I mentioned, some of these are a little bit harder than others. Let's start with number 7. Let's assume it's a snake robot swimming through the virtual water. How many nodes are in the genotype that encodes that phenotype? 1, right? So if you kind of squint, it looks like all the objects that make up robot number 7 are more or less the same. So you can imagine one node that has one recurrent edge, right? Create the head of the snake, follow the edge and compute the deltas, which sort of move the cursor, if you like, or the thing that's building the robot, moves it backwards a little bit, and it places a slightly smaller object behind the head and connects it to the head. Then we're still at the same node. There's only one node in the genotype. Follow the edge again, same edge, which has the same deltas. So it says, again, move backwards and shrink things a little bit and attach to the object in front of you. After 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 iterations through the node, the recursive limit reaches 0, and construction stops, and off we go. How about some of the others?
This might be kind of trivial, but if it like reached 7, could it have a terminal only that has like 2 more iterations? Because I thought it had like flippers or something on the ends.
Possibly, yeah, maybe these are a little bit different. It's hard to say, right? It may not be one node that's iterated through 9 times. Right? If we take that one node genotype and hit it with a mutation that alters the recursive limit, changes the value of the recursive limit, and leaves everything else untouched, tell me about the child snake. How is it going to differ from its parent?
The length of the snake.
The length of the snake. It'll have more or less segments than its parent, but will have more or less the same structure. Right?
All the segments will be the same size too, and orientation.
Exactly. They'll all sort of shrink by the same 10% as you travel from the head to the tail. Right? Imagine, again, we go back to this individual and we hit it with a mutation that changes one of the deltas on one of the edges. So instead of shrinking the object by 10%, it changes that minus 10% to a plus 10%. Tell me about that child snake. How will it differ from its parent?
Also like a cone and have a small head.
It'll have a small head and then a larger and larger body. Right? So you get a sense how even random mutations that hit the genotype can have non-random effects. Right? We're scaling or shrinking or lengthening or shortening the phenotype. Okay, what are some of the other robots here and how do you think they're encoded?
Number 6 probably has a, I would say it has 2 edges, one edge that has a change in orientation and then a reflection.
Okay.
And so that's how it gets the fan arms on each side.
Okay.
And then a recursion for each segment.
A recursion for each segment, right? So we probably have a node called segment, and this recurses 3 times to produce the 3 segments. So there's a recursive limit of 2, if we count down 2, 1, 0. Yeah. And then off of that are probably 2 outgoing edges that have their own deltas associated with them, do they each arrive at a different node or the same node? Is this a genotype with 3 nodes in it or 2? 2, right? Because you can sort of see that the left-hand flipper looks very much like the right-hand flipper, right? They're probably encoding the same thing, so we've probably got a 2-node genotype in that case.
We did 12, which is very similar, but you've got three petals, and they each recurse one to make it 2-legged.
Exactly, I think you're right. Yeah. Okay, so you can sort of, at your leisure, look at some of the others, or even do this with pen and paper. You start to get an intuition for how these genotypes operate and the kinds of phenotypes they produce.
Could you pass on like a variable to the child, and then like plug in that variable to like a function, so you can get like a sine function of the rate of the lengths getting bigger and smaller as you go down iterations?
Not in this implementation, but if we have time next week, we're going to look at a more sophisticated, actually we'll probably look at it on Tuesday, that uses a more sophisticated data structure known as an L system to do more or less what you're describing. Yep, that's a good observation. Okay. We got 2 minutes left, so let's end with the brain of these robots. As I promised, these graphs are nested graphs. So we're now looking at the full genotype over here. In this case, like we were just describing, this is a version of robot 6 here. We've got 2 nodes, one that describes the body segment, and the second one that describes the flipper. There's a third node which has this dashed edge around it, and this is a special node. There's only 1 copy of it in each genotype. This encodes neural information. You can see 3 neurons in here, and the smaller arrows in here, the nested arrows, represent synapses. This is the central nervous system, or the central brain of the robot. This is only copied once into the body of the robot. This neural structure in here, each of the 2 parts of the neural network in these edges are known as the peripheral nervous system. We have peripheral nervous tissue in us as well, which is your spinal cord and bundles of nerve fibers throughout your legs and arms. So they're away from the central brain. You have more or less the same peripheral nervous system in your left arm as you do in your right. So as we're constructing this robot and we're creating 2 copies of this body part, whenever we create this body part, we also copy these 3 neurons into the body part. So there are these 3 neurons in here and another copy of those 3 neurons in here. This genetic material, this neural material gets copied into the 4 times into the 4 flippers. Just to finish things off, you'll notice these neurons have little labels associated with them. J0 and J1 are joint sensors, which are known in pyrosim as your proprioceptive sensors. The joint sensors give information about the current angle of the joint. Contact sensors are our touch sensors. Photosensors, we've seen those before. And you see E0 and E1, these are effectors or actuators. Those are the motor neurons inside the flipper that attach to the joint connecting the flipper back to the main body. So we're copying sensor neurons, motor neurons, and internal neurons, and we're copying it and patterning it throughout the body of the robot. We'll finish that off next Tuesday. You have a quiz due tonight. Undergrads, you have your final weekly report due Monday night. See you Tuesday.